Hello everyone, my name is Ben, and I'm the SpicyGameDev. Today, I'm going to be showing you how to set up an ability with a dynamic cooldown. First off, I'll just demonstrate to you what the end result will be. I'm going to take a basic grenade, which I have here, and we're going to set it up. I will step you through the process. I'm going to set it up so that it has a dynamic cooldown, and so each time we grab one of these gems, it's going to reduce the cooldown of the grenade by 1 second. So if I throw it right now, you can see that the cooldown is 6 seconds long. So if I go ahead and pick each of these gems up, now I can throw it again, and it is 2 seconds long. At the end of this video, you will understand how to apply this method to your games and set up abilities with dynamic cooldowns. Dynamic cooldowns are pretty important for when you want to let players do things like upgrade abilities, or part of the upgrade may be reducing the cooldown of the ability. So to get started with setting up a dynamic cooldown, we're going to go ahead and get the basic grenade from core content. So just search for that and drag it into the hierarchy. And if we look at this, we can see that it has two abilities, a throw and a reload, and a pickup trigger, and then just the art, which we can see here. And in this case, the reload ability isn't really being used since the ammo is set to -1, which means it has infinite ammo, so it's never actually using that reload ability. But if we look at the throw ability, we can see that on its settings it has a cooldown of 3. And before we get too far into the tutorial, I just wanted to quickly explain what I mean when I say dynamic cooldown. And what I mean by that is having a cooldown that can change at runtime or when the game is running. And the reason that this is tricky is that we cannot directly change or set this cooldown duration at runtime. If we look at the core API page and we go to ability, you can scroll down here. And you can see that there's the in the properties it has cast phase settings. It has phase settings for all the different phases. So if we go to the ability phase settings, and we can see it has that duration property there. But unfortunately for us, it's just a read-only property, so we can't actually change it. Basically meaning whatever we set it to in the editor, that's basically what the cooldown is going to be. But a few patches ago, there was a new function or feature that was added for abilities, which does allow us to kind of, I don't know if cheat is the right way to word it, or basically have a workaround and setting up a dynamic cooldown. And that function is called advanced phase. So advanced phase basically, an ability has 4 phases. It has the cast, the execute, the recovery, and the cooldown. So what advanced phase allows us to do is basically to call this function on an ability, and it will basically just immediately move whatever current phase that it's in. So let's say it was in cooldown. If we advance the phase, then it's just going to go right to the ready state, or change that ability state to ready, which thereby will shorten the cooldown or reduce the cooldown. So if we let's say we wanted to make the cooldown was originally like 6 seconds and we wanted to reduce it to 3 seconds, then we can just put a logic to essentially wait for 3 seconds and then advance the phase, and that will essentially give us a cooldown of 3 seconds. So back in the other, there's one more component that we want to get before we continue on, and that is the ability display. So if we type for or search for ability display, We can go ahead and drag this in the hierarchy, and essentially what this is going to do is just give us a UI representation or visual representation of what our ability's cooldown is as it's happening. So, if our cooldown is 3 seconds, it will start at 3 seconds and count down for us and let us know, when can I use, or when's the ability, ready to be used. So I'm just going to make one modification to this. For some reason, I noticed that it has this reference missing, but this reference isn't actually used in the script at all. So you can go ahead and de-instance this and just remove this reference right there. And then also I'm going to move the panel to the bottom right. Just setting the anchor and dock to bottom right. Drag this over a little bit just so it's in the bottom right corner for me. And that's it for that. So now if we go into play mode, this grenade a bit closer to my spawn. So now I can go into play mode and we can see how this grenade works. So you can see in the bottom right hand corner my UI cooldown display is showing there, so I can throw the grenade. It shows when I can use it next, so now I can use it again, and it shows when the cooldown is happening. Perfect. So the first thing I'm going to do is in the grenade for the throw ability, I'm just going to go ahead and set the cooldown to like 6 seconds just so we have something to kind of work down from for reducing the cooldown. So just update that. And then next, I'm going to go ahead and create a new script which will control the dynamic cooldown logic for us. So go ahead and go to create new script, and we can just call this example dynamic cooldown. So you can go ahead and open this script up. So for this script, we're going to need to hook into both the cast event and cooldown events for the throw ability of our grenade. So also make sure drag this under the grenade weapon. And since we're going to need to connect to the events of this ability, we're going to need a reference to it. So let's go ahead and drag that into the custom properties of our script, and we'll just call this throw ability. And just go ahead and copy the snippet for that custom property there. Go back to our script and paste that in. So now we can go ahead and set up the functions for those events. So first we can go ahead and set up the cast. Then we can go ahead and set up the cooldown as well. Now what we don't want to do is forget to actually connect these functions to the events. Now back at the top of the script, I'm going to set up another I'm going to set up a global variable called custom cooldown. And for now we can just set this to 3. And in the onAbility cooldown function, we can start setting up the logic that will essentially advance the phase after our custom cooldown is finished. So the first thing we want to do is set up a Task.Spawn function. Now a Task.Spawn function is a special function which we can see here in the documentation. If you go to core API, and then to the task object here in this. And you can see Task.Spawn here takes a function, task function, and then it has optional parameter for a number delay. So it says creates a new task which will call task function without blocking the current task. The optional delay parameter specifies how many seconds before the task schedule should run the task. And it says by default, the schedule will run the task at the end of the current frame. So what this essentially means is that Task.Spawn it's not going to stop here and wait for that delay. It's going to spawn a new, or basically kind of like branch off and create like a parallel task that's going to run at the same time. So let's go ahead and get this set up. So we can just do task.spawn, and here we're going to put function with parentheses like this, and then with an end. And after the end, we can put the comma, and this is where we'll want to put our custom cooldown, which I just noticed I put an E on the end of. So we can put custom cooldown here. And within this function, we want to call the ability advanced phase. So we can just do this ability and then the advanced phase function. Now, there's a couple checks that we want to do here in order to make sure that this advanced phase can happen, because essentially it's going to wait, in this case, it's going to wait for 3 seconds and then actually run this logic. So after it waits for that 3 seconds, we need to validate that the ability still exists and that it's still in the cooldown phase. So let's put an if statement here to check that. So let's double check that the object is still valid, which we can just use object.isValid and check the ability. And we also want to make sure that this ability is still in that cooldown phase. So we can use get current phase and check if that is equal to the cooldown phase. And we're just going to cut and paste our advanced phase into that if statement. Now let's do a quick test and double check that this is working. So go ahead and save my script, and I will update this template. Make sure we have the event log ready. And if I press play, I can grab the grenade, and we should see that it will have a cooldown of 3 seconds. Though currently how the ability display is set up, it unfortunately does not work. So you should be able to use the ability when it shows 3 seconds. So let's go ahead. And you can see right there, once it hit the 3 second mark, the UI just kind of went reset. So if I throw it again and I click the left mouse button, I can't use it, and then as soon as it resets, I can use it again. So we can see that the cooldown that we're setting through script here is working, the 3 seconds. Now what we want to do next is we want to be able to have some kind of event or interaction or something that's going to be driving what our cooldown is. So we're actually going to set this up with that pickup that I showed you at the beginning of the video. So every time that we pick one of those items up, it's going to reduce our cooldown by 1 second. So to get that set up, we actually need to go ahead and create those pickups. So in order to do that, I'm going to search for the resource pickup template and core content. Now this is basically designed and set up to give the player a specific resource, an amount of a resource when they overlap or run into this object. It has a trigger, and for that overlap event, when a player overlaps with that trigger, it's going to give that player whatever resource that you specify here in these custom properties. So we're going to modify this, or use this template but modify it a bit. So let's go ahead and take a look at the script. So looking at the script, you can see that just as I was describing to you, it has the onBegin overlap event, and it's just doing a check to see if it's a player that overlapped. And then here is where it's checking that you entered or put a non-empty string for that resource, and then is giving the player that resource that was specified in the custom properties. So we don't really want to do a resource here. Instead, we're going to set it up to essentially decrease a server user data value that we're going to set. So we're going to use server user data, which is essentially just a table that is on all core objects. So if we go to core object and go down to, or sorry, not core object, object is what we're looking for here. Object. So here we can see any object has both server user data and client user data. So we're going to use server user data and just store on the player what their grenade cooldown is. So here we already know that whatever interact or passed through or overlapped with the trigger is a player. So we can just go ahead and do other dot server user data. Then we can do dot grenade cooldown, and we can just set this equal to, I just want to subtract 1 from it. So grenade cooldown -1. And we basically want to put a check in here that it's not going to go below 1 second, because things might get a little weird if that happens. So we're just going to double check that if this is below 1, then we can just set it back to 1. But now every time that we pick up one of these items, it's going to reduce or subtract 1 from this server user data, which we're going to set up in our dynamic cooldown script to use. So let's go ahead and make sure to copy this portion, and we can go back to our dynamic cooldown script, and instead of using this variable here, we can just set it up to use that server user data. So we have access to the ability, and in this case we want to get access to the owner of the ability, so we can just do .owner, and then we can access that player's server user data and get whatever their grenade cooldown is. So now if we save this, just double checking that I'm saving my scripts, and we can go back and push play. So now if I go and grab the grenade and throw it, you can see that there is a slight issue. So for some reason, you can see it starts at 6 seconds and then like immediately stops. or resets. So what is going on with our cooldown? So the issue is that we're never initiating what this value should be. So here with the pickup, we set it up to reduce the server user data, but we actually need to initiate this. And the best way to do that is, or the easiest in this case, this example, is to just set this value when the player joins. So let's go ahead and set up a OnPlayerJoin function, or not function, a script. So if we go up to Window, and we can go down to the script generator. This is just a quick way to set this up. So you can go to Event Player Join Leave, and let's create a script from this. And we'll just call this on player joined. Exit out of that. And we can go ahead and drag this to the hierarchy here. So if we open this script, you can see that it already has these two functions set up for player joined and player left, and they're already connected and everything. So it's really helpful to use the script generator in that case. So here, we just want to take this server user data, go ahead and set it to let's do 6 seconds, which is default cooldown right now. So 6 seconds. Okay. Now let's go and close this. And let's also just update this template for the resource pickup. And we're just going to adjust the position of this, bring it a little closer to the spawn, and duplicate it just a few times so we can reduce our cooldown by a couple seconds here. So now if I push play, we can test this out again. I'll pick up my grenade, throw it once, and you can see the cooldown is counting down 6 seconds. Now if I go and pick up my gems, which I guess my gems are not working. Let's pause real quick and take a look at our resource pickup server. So yeah, there's one thing that I forgot to here. So it has a boolean that it's checking right here that we don't really need in this case, so we can just delete this. And save that. Let's try this again. So again, throw my grenade, counting down from 6 seconds. And now I can go pick up the gems. And my cooldown should be 2 seconds long now, which the display is still not set up properly yet. We're going to do that next. But if I go ahead and throw this, you can see that it resets after 2 seconds. And that's pretty much all there is to it for setting up a dynamic cooldown. If we look back at our dynamic cooldown script here, it's really just these 7 or so lines here that are the really really important lines of driving this. And it's, whatever value that we are putting here, that's going to drive what our cooldown is. So in this case, I'm using, server user data, which is stored on the player. But you could also, use maybe a resource as well. And having it set up this way means that I can pick up a grenade. Maybe I'm running around the map getting other pickups, or maybe other pickups and reducing my cooldown. And I throw my grenade, and maybe it only has a one-time use. Well, the next grenade that I pick up, I'm still going to have that same cooldown, since we're storing it in server user data or a resource of some sort. And the same goes for something like, let's say you have an ability that players can upgrade. If you're always storing the cooldown of that ability somehow, then when they do that upgrade, you can just modify whatever value, maybe it's in their data or something like that, whatever value that you're using, and just modify that and change the cooldown that way. So the last thing that I still need to show you is how to fix the UI to show the correct cooldown duration. So right now the issue that's happening and why this isn't working is because we're changing what the cooldown is dynamically on the server, but the client is unaware that we're doing that. So we need to somehow communicate to the client that, hey, the cooldown has been updated or changed to this value. Because right now the client is looking at the cooldown that's set in the ability properties, so it thinks it's still 6 seconds. It's never being told or being updated to know that we have changed how we're doing the cooldown. So let's go ahead and do that next. We're going to go ahead and open up the AbilityDisplayClient script. So this script is what's running that little icon in the bottom right corner of the screen and controlling, the countdown of the countdown of the cooldown and the little animation that does, as it is, going down. And I don't want to get too much into the details of how this works, just for time's sake, but very briefly, the bulk of the logic is happening in this tick function. And what it's doing is it's calling this update current ability. So it's going to go here, and basically it's going to check to see if there's an ability that is matching this custom property here. So right now, the binding that we have specified here is the ability primary, which is the same bind that we're using for our throw ability. So if we go back into the script, it's basically checking to see if there's an ability on the local player. So it's it's getting the local player's abilities and looping through those and seeing if any of those have a binding that match the bind that we set in the custom properties. So it gets that new ability, and if it's equal to the current ability, which is a global that they have set right here, then it's just going to return. Otherwise, it's going to go ahead and update current ability to new ability. And it's also going to get that new ability's execute duration, recovery duration, and cooldown duration. Now, like I said before, it's getting the cooldown from the duration from the cooldown phase settings. So it's getting the cooldown which we see set here in the properties of the ability. So that is what update current ability does. And so once it's updated current ability, it's going to go ahead and double check that current ability is not set to nil. And if it's not, then it's going to get the current phase of the ability and the phase time, which is just the time remaining in the current phase. And then it's going to determine whether or not it should, show or hide the UI, if the ability is disabled or enabled, or just change the color of the UI. And then it's going to check and see what phase the ability is in, and if it's in the ready or cast phase, then it's just going to hide that countdown text and the progress indicator. So the 5 would be the countdown text, and the progress indicator would be that animated piece that you saw that kind of went around in a circle as it counted down. So if it's in one of those two states, it's going to hide those. But if it's in the execute, recovery, or cooldown phase, then it's going to go into this else statement, and it's going to turn the visibility of those on, and it's essentially going to calculate how much cooldown is remaining, and then update that text and progress indicator to basically show to the player how much cooldown is remaining. So that's a basic overview of kind of how this script works. And essentially what we need to do now is to modify it to work with the system that we set up on the server, where we are dynamically changing the cooldown. And in order to do that, we need to somehow get the new cooldown, or the current cooldown, to the client. We need to somehow get that information to the client. And the best way, or maybe not the best way, but a way to get that information, in this case, for the example that we're doing, is to set up a custom property. So since we already have access, or I'm getting what the ability, or not what the ability is, but the ability object, let's go ahead and set up a custom property on our throw ability. So we'll deinstance this, and we'll add a custom property that is a float. So let's just call it custom cooldown. And we want to right click and enable, right click and enable the property networking, is what it's called. And we can just leave this at 0, and we can update this template right there. So in our dynamic cooldown script, whenever we are casting the ability, we want to essentially set this network custom property so that we know what the latest, or so that the client can be updated with what the latest cooldown is. So that's why I initially set up this on ability cast. So in this on ability cast, we're going to go ahead and just set that custom property that we just made, network custom property, to this to that player's server user data for grenade cooldown. So we can go ahead and do this ability set network custom property, and we're going to give it the property name, which was, I believe, custom cooldown, and we're going to give it the value that we want to set it to. So we can just go ahead and copy this, paste it right there. So now, every time that we use the ability, it's during the cast phase, it's going to update this network custom property. That way, by the time it gets to the cooldown, it can, it will use our dynamic cooldown system, but then for on the client side, the client will have that information to be able to update the UI for us. So now that we have set this up, we can return to the AbilityDisplayClient script. So in this script, we need to add some logic to basically check and see if current ability is using a dynamic cooldown. And so how we can do that is do a check and see if it has that custom property that we made, the custom cooldown property. So we can do current ability. So if current ability get custom property, so we want to check and see if it has this custom property. And what we want to do is then update what this cooldown duration value is. So if it does have the custom property, then let's set the cooldown duration to what that custom property is. And that will give us the updated cooldown value, which we set here in the cast phase. Otherwise, we can just set the cooldown to whatever the cooldown phase settings are. So now we've saved our script and we can go ahead and test this. So if we pick up the grenade and throw it, we get that initial cooldown of 6 seconds. So let's go ahead and pick up all our gems, and we should see that it should now count down from 2 seconds. So you can see there that it did not count down from 2 seconds. It's still starting. Well, it's doing something weird, right? It starts at 2 and then for some reason jumps to 6 seconds and then disappears. So why is our code not working properly here to display the cooldown? I mean, we're checking for the custom property and got the new cooldown duration, set that value, so why isn't that being reflected in the UI and showing the correct numbers and such? Well, the issue has to do with the fact that we're not updating or calculating player cooldown remaining time properly. If you look here in the comment, it says for a player, the recovery, cooldown, and execute phases all constitute as the ability's cooldown. So it's taking all 3 of those into consideration. So let's do a step-by-step run through in the case of if the ability is in the execute phase. So the ability is in the execute phase. We just started the execute phase. Current phase is going to be set to execute. The phase time here is going to be set to, in this case, 0.1, because that's what the execute duration is set to for our throw ability. So let's go ahead here and we'll just put comments in to track this. So phase time equals 0.1. So then if we go down here, player cooldown is going to be set to phase time. So let's put this in a comment. So player cooldown remaining is going to equal 0.1. Then we're going to do our check here to see if it has that custom property and is using our dynamic cooldown system. In this case, our ability does have that custom property. So let's say that the dynamic cooldown is set to 3 seconds in this case, okay? So just pretend right now that this is set to 3. Up our script back. So we'll set cooldown duration equal to 3 seconds. So then we're going to check and see, do some checks and see what phase it is that the ability is in. So here it's seeing if current phase is not equal to cooldown, so which means it's either in the execute or recovery phases. So since we are in the execute phase in this example, we are going to enter into this if statement. So we're going to take player cooldown and basically add the cooldown duration to it. So after this, player cooldown remaining is going to be equal to 3.1 because we're going to take that 0.1 and add it to 3. So that's the updated value. It's our current value. Now we do the next check and see if it's in the execute phase. And we are in the execute phase, so now we take player cooldown remaining and update it again. And this time we're adding the recovery duration. So now our player cooldown remaining will be equal to 3.1 plus 0 or 0.01. It'll be 3.1. And that's what will be displayed initially at the start of the execute phase. So now let's go back and do this all again, but this time pretend that we are in the cooldown phase. So I'm going to erase these values, go back up to the top of the script, or not top of the script, but top of this tick. And this time, let's pretend that we're in the cooldown phase. So current phase will be equal to cooldown, but phase time, now this is where it might be a bit confusing. Phase time is actually going to be equal to 6 seconds because we just started the cooldown phase, right? It's getting the time remaining in the phase, and for this ability, its cooldown duration is set to 6 seconds, right? Because we're not actually editing this value at all. We're using the advanced phase to kind of skip ahead or to reduce our cooldowns. So let's put 6 seconds here. That's the phase time. And if we skip back down here and here on line 126, it's setting the player cooldown remaining to phase time, so it's equal to 6 seconds. And again, we do our check and see if we have that custom property, which means we're using the dynamic cooldowns, in which case we are. So our dynamic cooldowns, remember, is set to 3 seconds, so this will be set to 3. And here again, we're checking to see if we're in either the execute or recovery phase, which we're not, so this will still be equal to 6 seconds. And then we're checking to see if we're in the execute phase, which we're not, so this is still equal to 6 seconds. So you can see by kind of doing this simple kind of exercise and running through different scenarios, we kind of found out why this isn't working. It's getting the phase time and it's basing that off of what the default or hard set value is for the cooldown duration on the ability object. And it's not getting what and it's essentially not using our modified cooldown value, right? So now what we can do to fix this is do a modification here in this if statement. So what we can do here is basically do a check and see if we are in the if the current phase is equal to the cooldown phase. So let's go ahead and check if current phase is equal to cooldown. So we do ability phase dot cooldown. So if we are in the cooldown phase, then we want to go ahead and modify player cooldown remaining. So what we're first going to do is calculate the elapsed phase time. So we're going to do current ability dot cooldown phase settings dot duration, and we're going to subtract the phase time. Now remember, phase time is the time remaining in that phase. Okay. So once we've calculated that, then we can update player cooldown remaining, and we're just going to do cooldown duration minus that elapsed time. Alright, so now that we've done this change, let's go through one more time and do this exercise and see if this fixes the issue. So we're pretending that we're just starting the cooldown phase again. So current phase is equal to cooldown. Phase time is equal to that 6 seconds. That didn't change. Come back down here. Player cooldown remaining is going to equal 6 seconds again. But this time, we're going to go into this if statement because our ability has that custom property. We're going to update the cooldown duration. So cooldown duration is going to equal that 3 seconds. And then since we are in the cooldown phase, the elapsed time here is going to just equal 0 because there hasn't been, like, we just started the phase, so there hasn't been any time that's elapsed yet. So that's going to equal 0, and then so the cooldown duration minus that elapsed or time phase is just going to be 3 seconds. So here we are updating the player down remaining to that 3 seconds. So after that if statement, player cooldown remaining is going to equal 3 seconds. And that's going to carry through all the way down here. And we're going to get the correct value now. So I'm going to go ahead and just clean up these comments. So let's save the script, and now let's go ahead and push play. Oh, just double check that this updated. Right? So now we can push play, and I can pick up my grenade And if I throw it, you see we get that cooldown of 6 seconds. Now I can get 2 gems, and if I throw the grenade, you see I get a cooldown of 4 seconds. And if I get the other 2 gems, I'm just going to pause it here really quick, you can see that I get a cooldown of 2 seconds. So now our dynamic cooldown system is fully working, with it changing the cooldown of the ability on the server, but then also displaying what that cooldown is properly on the client. And that is going to wrap up this video for today. If you guys are interested in downloading everything that we created in this tutorial as a template, you can go ahead and search on community content for SpicyGameDev. And you'll see here it's under dynamic cooldown for abilities. And you can go ahead and import this into your project and take a deeper look into all the scripts, and maybe even tweak this a little bit and edit it, make some changes, and find a way to implement it into your games. So if you guys enjoyed this video, then go ahead and hit the like button, and if you have any questions about dynamic cooldowns, then drop a comment down below. I would love to hear from you. And lastly, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you can get any notifications for when my next tutorial comes out. Thanks for watching, and stay spicy.